Today we're talking about motion blur, shutter speed, and if the 180-degree rule should be respected if delivering at frame rates higher than 24p. Let's get undone. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So I was asked to tackle this topic by a gentleman named Philip on Twitter, who had made a video about the 180-degree rule on YouTube that seemed to stir up some controversy and misconceptions. And he wanted me to try and create a test to demonstrate it for him. In his video, he talked about how the rule originates in rotary disc shutters from older cameras that aren't really used today, and thus he felt that the rule needn't be strictly followed, especially when shooting at higher frame rates. For those that don't know, those old rotary discs, when set to 180 degrees, would essentially have half a circle or 180 degrees of a spinning disc open and 180 degrees closed to only allow the film to be exposed for about 50% of the time. On modern cameras, we try to emulate this effect by setting our shutter speed to as close to that ratio as possible by doubling our frame rate and using that as our denominator in the shutter speed fraction. So 24p would be 1/48 or 1/50th of a second shutter speed. Philip's stance was that if you're always respecting the 180-degree rule, then at 120 frames per second, you'll have a 1/250th of a second shutter speed, and therefore you'll have insufficient motion blur. Conversely, the most common argument in support of the 180-degree rule, even at higher frame rates, is that the relationship between the frame rate and the shutter speed should remain constant to keep the effect of that relationship consistent in your videos. So I've made this little test setup here using a drill and a ruler. I'm able to spin this at just over 1 second for full rotation and then shoot it at different frame rates and shutter speeds. This gives me a controlled look at motion blur for each combination. It does accelerate a bit on the downswing, but that too remains consistent so it doesn't affect our measurements. So let's go over these clips together and discuss the results, but there are a few questions I want to try and answer with this test. 1, when it comes to motion blur, is shutter speed the only thing that matters, and will the amount of blur remain the same even when changing frame rates as long as the shutter speed is the same? 2, should you use the 180-degree rule for frame rates higher than 24p? 3, what has the biggest impact on the feel of a video and that soap opera effect we associate with higher frame rates? Is it the fact that there are more frames, or that the shutter speed is higher? And finally 4, which combination looks most natural? For that last point, I've recruited some of my nerdy internet friends to give their opinions on the test as well, so that we can get some different perspectives on what looks best to different eyes. Alright, so let's start with question number 1. What affects motion blur? Going through the shots, I can tell you that it doesn't matter the frame rate. The amount of blur is determined by the shutter speed alone. We can see this by just pausing the ruler in the same position and gauging how thick it looks or how long the trails are. It doesn't matter if we shoot at 24 frames per second at 1/50th or 60 frames per second at 1/50th, the ruler looks the same. And it also doesn't matter what the project frame rate is either. This video is being uploaded at 24 frames per second to YouTube, so I can't really show you true 60 FPS, but I compared the 60p footage in a 60p timeline on my computer, and the results were the same as the 24p timeline for motion blur, as long as the shutter speed was the same. And this observation is likely what inspired Philip to make his video, and which brings us to question number 2. Knowing this, should we still use the 180-degree rule for higher frame rates? For that, it depends on how you're delivering the content. If you're shooting 60p or 120p with the intention of slowing it down in post to fit a slower timeline, like 24p, then yes, you should absolutely still respect the 180-degree rule. It's true that the motion blur will be reduced because the shutter speeds will be much higher. Here, have a look at what 1/250th of a shutter looks like compared to 1/50th. You can see that if you follow the 180-degree rule for 120p, you'll get much less motion blur. But the reason why this looks natural is because when slowed down, the object is moving at a much slower rate, so your eyes expect less motion blur. If you kept the 1/50th of a second shutter, it would be way too blurry for a ruler moving that slowly. So that's why we should keep the 180-degree rule for slow motion footage to maintain that speed to blur relationship. However, that also means the opposite is true if you're not slowing down your footage. So say you're shooting at 60p and you're either delivering in 60p, or you plan to just put it in a 24p timeline and drop frames. In either of those cases, you should use a slower than 180-degree shutter like 1/50th or 1/60th. Because you aren't slowing down, so your motion blur shouldn't be reduced. Ideally, to make it the most consistent with your 24p work, you would use a 1/50th of a second shutter, but some cameras won't allow you to choose a shutter speed lower than your frame rate because it can cause judder. So in that case, just use 1/60th. The difference in a third of a stop is minimal, which we can see here by comparing the two. The 1/60th shot is only slightly thicker with slightly longer trails, not enough to really make a huge difference and only noticeable when comparing side by side. For fun, here's some different photos at different shutter speeds to give you an idea of how much shutter speed affects motion blur. So if moving from 1/50th to 1/60th of a second shutter doesn't change the shot that much, why does 30p look so much different than 24p? It can't be the motion blur, it must be the frame rate. Which brings us to question number 3. What causes the soap opera effect, and can you minimize it with slower shutter speeds? For this question, and question number 4 about which looks the most natural, I've enlisted the help of some of my fellow YouTube nerds because I can't actually show you different frame rates in a single video. But if you look in the description, I've included a link to a video that shows 60p footage on a 60p timeline at a few different shutter speeds for you to evaluate the differences. But if I were to give you my opinion, I'd say that the biggest impact to a video feeling filmic and natural to me is the frame rate. 1/60th at 24p looks much different than 1/60th at 30p, and I'm more used to seeing the 24p version. And this difference is dramatically increased when switching to 60p. However, I do find that reducing the shutter speed when shooting 60p does reduce some of that soap opera effect, and I definitely would rather watch 60p at 1/60th of a second than 60p at 1/125th for real-time playback. Again though, for slow motion, I'd rather have 1/125th. But let's see what other people have to say.
Honey?
Yeah?
Are my zebras at 55?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm making a video for Gerald.
Okay.
So, Okay. Hi, Gerald. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Jordan Drake here from DP Review TV, and I was able to take a look at the files that Gerald recorded. Excellent job with the screwdriver there, Gerald.
Okay, so I just watched the clips, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening there in my brain.
Since I lack the technical vocabulary to adequately explain my observations, I'll just do what they do on sci-fi TV and make stuff up. If I got any or all of these answers wrong, it's only because I copied off of Tyler Stalman.
I have no idea what Gerald is trying to get me to look at with these, so hopefully I said something useful.
So let's start with this one. I don't like the way this looks a lot. I find it a little choppy.
The 24 at 1/125th had the most separation, huge separation, and just looked all shades of janky as well.
Most of all, what needs to feel right in these is that ruler, that spinning object, feels like it's just one physical thing. Sometimes, especially like 24 frames per second at 1/25th, it would start to kind of break apart, and the stuttering effect would make it feel like there are more than one rulers spinning around. That starts to break the illusion of reality in a bad way.
This is fantastic. It's fluid. I like this a lot.
The control shot, the 24 frames per second at 1/50th shutter, I thought it definitely had like a cinematic vibe to it, which, I mean, obviously that's what we talk about, but I thought that was really interesting that I could see it even though it was just like a spinning piece of cardboard on a drill. It definitely had that movie kind of vibe.
And this one has the soap opera effect, which I sometimes enjoy, but the one above it, the 50th one, looks the most natural to me.
The 60 at 1/50th looked the most like the control, just separating on the down arc and coming back together on the up with a good trail while not being really fussy about it.
Okay, so this looks really good.
And then for the slowed down one, I like the 60 frames per second at 1/60th shutter, which I also thought was really interesting.
The 60p slow to 1/60th looks just blur-ee, like there's a glow more than a trail.
A 60th of a second shutter speed looks pretty weird to my eyes. Now, I've actually used this before if I know I'm going to be slowing the footage down and I want things to look like they were moving faster than they actually did, then 60 frames per second at a 60th of a second is useful, but for general shooting, I'm going to follow the old 180-degree rule, and when you're shooting at 1/125th of a second, it just looks better to me.
And this one looks choppy, the second slowed down one. This looks very bad. This almost looks like it's interlaced. It's like trying to refresh the frames. I don't like this at all.
Those both actually felt real. You know, the 60th would be weird with other motion, but the blur really made it feel like one unified object. But there is something interesting about the 60 frames per second where it really feels tangible and feels directly in front of you. So in this example, I liked the 60. It was actually pretty cool to watch.
All right, so let's wrap up. Most people suggested that overcranking your shutter when shooting at 24 frames per second looks kind of choppy. Most people also thought that the 60p footage that wasn't slowed down and that was shot at 1/125th had the greatest soap opera effect and was least desirable. and everyone thought that the 24p at 1/50th looked the most natural, but I'll be the first to admit that this is likely due to years of conditioning and exposure to a standard that stretches back to before we were born. The most interesting and most polarizing comparison was the slowed down 60p footage though. Some people preferred the 180-degree rule at 1/125th of a second, and some preferred the blurrier 1/60th shutter. I personally think the 1/60th version is wrong from a physics standpoint. Objects moving that slowly shouldn't blur that much. But I do agree that shooting slow motion at a 360-degree shutter is a neat effect and could be desirable for creative purposes. So if we tried to wrap this up into a simple tip to remember, it would be yes, keep using the 180-degree rule for anything that involves real-time playback at 24, 25, or probably even 30p, and for any slow motion video beyond those frame rates. But use a 360-degree shutter angle for frame rates above 30p if you're delivering at those higher frame rates for real-time consumption. So 1/60th of a second shutter for non-slow motion 60p delivery, for example. Or just do whatever you want. What do I care?
The 125 frames per second and 60th of...
Some people preferred the 180-degree rule at 101 and 120... What am I saying? 100 and 125th of a second?
And my voice is okay? It's not clipping?
Say something. Do a little.
Test. Gerald. Gerald undone. Done. Gerald undone.
Yeah, you're good.
He's, yeah, okay, because he's crazy. I'm capturing the screen. Gerald, if you want, you can use the capture screen too. Very nice, I like it. Thank you, Gerald. See you later. Bye.
But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful. And if you did, make sure to leave the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. Yeah, all right. I'm done.